Welcome to Conquering Your Clownfish, a podcast dedicated to transforming disabilities into special abilities. I'm your host, Brady Murray. Welcome to the Conquering Your Clownfish podcast. I am honored to introduce my wonderful guest today, Camille Robinson. Camille is a mother, podcast host, and a dedicated community leader. Her son, Mason, was born with congenital heart disease and underwent 3 heart surgeries by the time he was just 18 months old. At 18 months as well, he was also diagnosed with autism. In the face of these challenges, Camille turned to the internet in search of connections and community, ultimately creating a supported community to assist other families on their journeys. Camille, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Oh, the honor is mine. I actually feel like our intro really doesn't do you justice when we talk about community. In the online community, within the disability community, there's some really incredible advocates and people that create community. But honestly, what you're doing is unlike anything I've ever seen. And so truly, it is an honor to have you on the show. I also think it's important to note, as part of your bio, we need to say future book or future author, because with the book deal, that's awesome.
Coming soon.
Congratulations on that.
Thank you
well
so
deserved.
much.
Very
Thank
much
you.
well deserved.
Yes.
Well, this is fun. I'm excited to be able to visit with you. We have a lot to be able to talk about today. I would love to just start with your journey and what you have felt have been a few of those pivotal moments in your journey. And let's start there.
Yeah. So, well, I'm a mom. Mason is my youngest of 5 boys. And so when he came, we weren't really expecting to get pregnant, but we did.
Yeah.
And, sometimes those oops happen.
Because your other boys are quite a bit older, right?
Yeah. There's a large age gap. So I have my youngest before Mason, who is 7 years old right now, he's going to be 18 next week. So he was already 11. Mm-hmm. And so right now, my oldest is 23. I have 23, 20, 19, and then 18. And Mason is 7. So there's that age gap. And I think it creates a dynamic where he's sort of kind of like an only child because he has no siblings to play with, his age. And so, yes, I'm a mom, I'm a wife, and the journey, I feel like there's so many streets, so many paths I can take as I talk about the journey. But Camille, myself, I was a young mom. And I think that's a part of my story a lot of people don't know because you see me today, but I wasn't always as strong as a person as I am today. So I became a mom at 16. And by 21, I had 4 kids. So,
Wow.
You hear that and you're like, what? Yes. And it, I just got caught up in a situation that really ended up being quite ugly. And I had 4 kids by the time I was 21. I was in an abusive relationship for 5 years. And I got out of that fairly early. By the time I was like 22, I decided, all right, this is enough. If I don't leave now, I'm going to have 10 kids. The guy was a lot older than me. And so I found myself really healing from that over the course of years in therapy and finding a relationship with God. I found myself really taking some time to heal from that. And then I met my husband. And so that is who I call my angel and has really helped me through this healing journey. And together we have a son named Mason. And so Mason, 22 weeks or so, when I was pregnant with him, the doctor told us that he would have congenital heart disease. During our ultrasound, we noticed that the technician, she had a look of concern on her face, and she didn't really tell us what was going on, but she called the doctor in the room, and the doctor said, well, your child is going to be born with congenital heart disease. He's going to have several heart defects, and we need you to make a decision quickly of whether you will keep him or not, because you're already at the point of where you can't terminate pregnancy. And so, of course, we were caught off guard with the news. And then now we're like, well, of course, we're going to keep the baby. And, we went through our pregnancy. We tried to not really think about it too much and hope for the best. I really tried hard to believe for a miracle. Like, I wanted to believe with all my heart that God would miraculously heal him. I feel like I was just talking about this the other day. Even though it may seem that autism was the thing that made me an advocate or a care or a friend to parents like me, it really was that time because I was so desperate and I was getting a lot of the wrong advice, especially within religion. I felt like I didn't know how to pray. I felt like what was wrong that, you know, it wouldn't end up the way that the Bible says it should for me. And so it was just a lot of wrong advice. And when I had Mason, he indeed ended up needing congenital heart surgery. He had a coarctation in his aortic valve, and that's, like a valve in his heart that had a little pinch, and they needed to open it up. So at 5 days old, he had surgery. And I remember the doctors not really knowing if he would need to come home or if they would operate. And then one day I was going down to the NICU and he was wrapped in wires and he had an IV coming from his head and I had just lost it. And I was uncontrollably crying because nobody told me anything that they were doing to him. And a nurse came over and a nurse said, "What's the matter? Why are you crying?" I said, "I don't even know what's going on." And I was uncontrollably crying. And grabbed my hand and she looked at me in my face. She said, "You tell those doctors not to put another finger on your child until they tell you what's going on and what they're doing."
For her.
And then that is when advocacy was born because sometimes
Wow.
it comes naturally for people, but sometimes you need someone to grab a hold of you to say, you are the one in control, even through doctors. And as we get different diagnoses and all those things, you can feel hopeless as a parent and you're just going, the way that the doctors lead, but you are in control. And so,
I am amazed and astounded and again, honored and humbled to have you as a guest on the show. That is remarkable. At the beginning of your story, what you shared in relation to having your voice and then making that very difficult and oftentimes I believe what people feel is impossible decision to be able to leave that relationship and
mhm,
to be able to seek healing, but you did it. You
yeah,
did it at that very young age. And now look at you at the impact that you're having in the world with what you've been entrusted. And so with Mason, this is unique because see, I always just envisioned you as like this strong, powerful, like very confident woman that was always an advocate. But that was not necessarily the case. And I mean, maybe that could be argued considering how well you did in leaving that relationship and making the most and amazing life out of that. But it was in that moment that you found Mason with all these wires and not knowing exactly what was going on, that amazing nurse helped you to be able to understand what an advocate is. And I have to say,
absolutely.
you're an incredible advocate. So that was an impactful moment.
It really was. Because I had no idea what to do. So having the guidance kind of stuck with me forever as it related to Mason.
So you worked through some of the challenges with the hard challenges, which thankfully things are progressing well there. But then you receive an autism diagnosis. Tell
Yes.
us about that.
And with Mason's heart today, we still go to the doctors every 3 months to have his heart checked because he has several heart defects. So we hope that his heart will grow with him. And so that continues to be monitored. And so with his diagnosis, I was the in denial parent. Mason, because of his heart condition, he stayed home with my husband while I went to work. And then when I came home, my husband went to work. So our schedules aligned so that for the first year and a half, Mason could be home. And then it was time for him to go to daycare. And probably a month after he started daycare, the teacher said, "Hey, mom, Mason is a little delayed in some things. And I want to know if you would let him get birth to three services." So in Connecticut, where I'm from, that's where early childhood intervention is called. And I said, no. I said, he's been through enough already. He's had so many heart surgeries. Absolutely not. And I was like, well, just come back to me in 3 months. Give him some time. He hasn't been around kids. I was just making up every excuse I could. And she did that. She said, okay, I'll do that. I'll keep watching. And she came back 3 months later and she said, Mom, nothing's changed. Can he receive early childhood intervention? And I said, yes. So at that moment, I decided from here on out, I wasn't going to be the in denial parent. I was going to be okay with getting him services. The word autism began to be thrown around, but I knew no one with autism. So I was kind of talking to friends and they were like, oh, it could be Asperger's, which that is autism, but when they don't know either.
Yeah.
And so through him receiving early childhood intervention, they suggested that he be diagnosed or evaluated for autism. And we received that diagnosis, and I was slightly in a place of, I will say, a little bit, not denial, but here's the thing. Because I'm a Christian, sometimes things are multi-layered for me. And this is also a moment that shifted who I am in my faith, but it gave me compassion and extra advocacy for special needs families within the faith. Because I thought, okay, Mason's autistic. I'm just going to pray this away. I really thought that. So I spent a year just praying, fasting, always praying against autism. And so one day I had an encounter in prayer. Through the Holy Spirit, I heard the Lord say, would you be praying this away if Mason had Down syndrome? And I sat up on the bed and I took deep breaths and then, I understood who I had, and God continued to speak to me and say who Mason was, and you don't even see who I gave you, and what a gift. And here you are. And it shifted how I prayed for him now. There's different prayers. I no longer see autism as the enemy. And this is what I teach other parents. This is what I teach when I teach courses for churches. Autism is not demonic. Autism is not something to be prayed away, and I was given a different eyesight, a set of lenses for special needs families and in autism.
Very tender and special experience, very powerful. And I think that as it relates to disabilities, I think that in the autism space, many parents struggle with it. And so having experience with Down syndrome, that's not something that you necessarily pray away. You know that that's a genetic disorder and it's a shock at first, and then you accept that and you come to grips with that. I would say it's a lot, diagnosis, a lot like going into a dark room and turning the light on, and it is what it is. It comes immediately and it's there.
Yep.
Autism diagnosis and that journey is very much like a sunrise, to where there's just the slightest glimmer that there might be a hint of something happening on that mountain range. And then as the morning grows, so grows that diagnosis and the clarity around what that envisions, or what that is envisioned like. And that is, to me, that is a much more difficult thing to process, because you really don't know what that looks like. But what a tender mercy you had in being able to receive that answer to your prayer. And I can just see that in a very powerful way, that it was almost like the Spirit was shaking you just a little bit with love, but grabbing you and saying, look at what you have, at what you have been entrusted. This is by divine design. And that was that paradigm shift for you. And again, with that knowledge and light that you've shared, think of how many families you've been able to help since then. That's quite remarkable.
And it gave me a special love for Down syndrome children, because they are what God used to help me accept my child. And so when I see someone with Down syndrome, I'm always smiling, and I'll go over and speak, or, I just have a special love for them.
Very nice. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I want to read a post that you shared about a week ago. This is a vulnerable post. I asked for permission to share this and to talk about this. And as I asked that permission, you told me that this post sat in your your drafts for quite some time, and you
Hmm.
pondered whether or not you were actually going to share it. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I had an event. It actually was an encounter, an experience. It actually was the night of the Super Bowl, where we were supposed to be watching the Super Bowl, but somehow we got into a deep conversation, me and my husband, which led to really hard tears. And on the post, I put it was on my end. I didn't want to embarrass my husband, but it was on both of our end. I didn't know how he would feel about me sharing him crying, so I kept that part out. And I just exposed myself. But we just acknowledged where we were, having conversations of not connecting, having conversations of if it would be better to separate or stay together. And I know statistically that 87% of parents who are raising children with disabilities, it ends in divorce. And I think a lot of times the conversation isn't had because you don't want to expose your marriage not being in a good place or a picture perfect place. But there is some distance that happens, and it's because can't just pick up and go. We can't just pick up and say, "Hey, let's go away for the weekend. Let's go on a vacation." We can barely go on dates in the evening because my child doesn't understand certain things, and I can't trust anyone with him. Honestly, I don't even leave him with his older brothers because they've not displayed that when he has a meltdown, they can work with him, they can understand. And it's just really difficult. I never want to make that their burden. So they have never, even 23 years old and down, they have never babysat him without me. And so
I'm going to
we
read
just,
this.
yep.
I want to acknowledge this. This is not, so for our listeners, and if this is your first exposure to Camille, what you've already gathered in just our short conversation is this is a very real, genuine person. What you see is what you get. What you see online with Camille is her as a person. There is no facade. She is sharing who she is as a person in a very real and vulnerable way. I actually think that's a large reason why you have so much reach is people recognize that and respect that. So I'm going to read part of this post. This was just a week ago. You said, "Can we talk about marriage a little more? Last night I cried in my husband's arms for over an hour as we acknowledged the raw place that we are in. We feel the weight of realizing we are not the same couple we were before we had our disabled child. We lost us as a couple. We are fighting through the heaviness, the exhaustion, the anger, the hurt that comes with raising a disabled child. We sat in truths never shared before and cried. Nobody talks about why 87% of marriages of special needs children end in divorce. But without saying, we as a community know why. It's a tough road and it's not easy to keep pressing to be the 13% who make it. As I closed my eyes, I said, Jesus, you promised to be our anchor. You promised to be our help. We need you to help us." That's about as vulnerable as you can get. It's one thing to share hard days with a child with a disability, but it's a whole nother to be able to be very open about the realities that we all face, myself included, when raising a child or children with unique differences with a disability. It is very taxing on a marriage. And I think that all too often we don't recognize or even realize that there is a mourning process for the life that we had that we all have to go through. And it's not something that you just go through. It's probably something that we'll work through for the rest of our lives. And so can you share with us more about this post and what that's brought for you and your husband since then and some of the responses that you've had from that post?
Yeah, I think you just mentioned the morning of the life you had. That was one of the things that my husband shared, that he missed what we had before, the difficulties. And, I was just blown away by his transparency in that moment. Um, there was an overwhelming response. There were like hundreds of comments. Then in my DM, people were sending me voice notes and long messages just to say, wow, I needed to see that. I'm trying, I'm pushing. Some parents who were in marriages and they didn't make it, they wanted to share. But when I share like this, I share for two reasons: for people watching, but also for me. It has caused me, it feels like therapy to me. My very first viral reel was me crying. So that was in 2021. I've been transparent along this journey. I brought Mason to the doctors one day and he was crying and screaming, pulling his ears for days. And I brought him to the ER because it was the weekend and the doctor was closed. And we tussled with him for a little while. And the doctor finally looked at me and she was like, I cannot check him because I do not want to traumatize him any further. She gave me some medicine and sent us on our way. And when I got in the car, I just started bawling. And then I recorded in that moment and I posted a bit of encouragement for families like me. And so there's just a weight that only we understand. I can't even accurately articulate it to someone who's not raising a child with
Right.
special needs. You just can't understand unless you are walking the road alongside of us. And on this globe, we have been blessed with social media. It is a true blessing because we get to see families like us, but we also get to connect with people who are walking the road and get a glimpse of hope, encouragement, strength along the journey. But I think there are a lot of parents who are just trying to hold on. And I wanted to post that to show that it's okay, because we always see maybe reels of people coming in the
All
house with
sunshine and
5 dozen roses. What'd you say? I'm sorry.
all sunshine and roses.
There you go. Literally roses. And vacations and smiles, but it's not that. And it can not be that for some years and a long season. So I just wanted to share that we were real. And I think maybe I shared a couple of days before Valentine's Day. And hey, so we are pressing. We are going to marriage counseling and just making a commitment to, try to prioritize us, because that's what the root really is. You know, we put the family and working and everything before us, and we can't.
No, I'm honestly a bit speechless because as you're sharing and as you're talking, I can just reflect on just my own stuff that we go through, Andrea and I, as a couple, and it's very real. And the reality is everybody that is on this journey, whether you have a child with a disability or not, most likely are having their own unique stuff that they have to work through as a couple. But then you amplify that with the child with a disability, that takes it on a whole new path and a whole new level. So I want to switch gears a little bit. This is another service that you provide. So you do a great podcast, you're writing a book, and you have an awesome gathering of caregivers. Can you share with us about this moment? I believe it's called Moments of Joy Fest. Is that correct?
Yes, we do an event and it's called the Moments of Joy Fest. And it's a event that is for all parents raising children with special needs. We usually do workshops and we have a panel discussion. We try to have respite care, and we do it just as a reason for families to get together. And people come from all over the world to really just for community, in-person community. I tell my husband all the time, they're not coming for me. They're coming to meet other people. That's what people come from. People have come from Canada, from London, from Kenya, from other states in the United States. So it's a needed thing. I did it for 2 years and I decided to pause this year because it costs a lot of money. I have too many projects going on at the same time. So financially, we took a pause, but we're going to do it again next year. When I did this post the other day, I wrote down this idea I had of doing a night for couples. So I think in 2025, that's something that maybe we can do. And, instead of doing that, we can create something nice and romantic for couples.
I think that's a great idea. That is something that I've noticed. There are a lot of really amazing support groups that will target a lot of support groups for moms. There's a few out there that are great for dads. Not a lot, but definitely a few that are out there. But as it relates to coming together as a couple and being able to share and be vulnerable and also just relax and enjoy peers as a couple, I think there's a really good idea to that. There's something to that for sure.
Thank you. Yeah, I thought, we might have some difficulty being romantic on our own, but what if we had help and just in a room it's already created for us?
I love it.
That could be a beautiful moment.
I love it. I agree. I totally agree with this. Well, this is wonderful. I wanted to share, there was one thing you had shared here that is very common. In fact, most of the time, families will respond in this way, in the same way that you did. And so I asked you, what is your biggest fear on this journey? And I'll read your response. You said, my biggest fear is that I will go before Mason and he won't be taken care of the way I would. That is terrifying. I think the same thing.
Yeah.
We meet with families all throughout the country, whether through this podcast, through Caring Tide, our disability planning company, and almost without exception, that is the biggest fear for families. And when we talk to them about their plan and their approach to be able to combat against this, many families say, I simply need to live at least one more day than my child.
Yeah.
That is terrifying and that is heartbreaking. And so share with me about this fear and your thoughts about this. I mean, Mason's 7. You and your husband are very young and have a long life ahead of you, but still right now, that is the biggest pressing thing from a fear standpoint.
It is. My kids tell me that I talk about death way too much. And I'm like, no, I do because maybe I do, but I do because we have to be prepared. At the thought of leaving and there's no plan, it just can't happen in this situation. So I have a plan of if my husband and I get in an accident, who's going to take care of Mason? I created an ABLE account because I thought maybe I would make him a custodial Roth IRA, but then I was like, okay, he won't be protected. So I found out about the ABLE account. And so we have a plan in place. I remember one day laying in a bed thinking about Mason going and me going before him, and I started crying and I sincerely prayed that God, you will give me long life and for the specific reason of being able to see Mason through. Will he be with me forever? I don't know. But my goal will always be for him to be independent. I haven't shared this past Friday, Mason, I accidentally, I'll say, got diagnosed with an intellectual disability, and they told me his IQ was about 50, and it was hard to digest. Again, I had his full scale IQ tested because I am looking to get him pulled out of public school. I was looking into autism only private school. I just thought that it'd be a better experience for him versus where he's at now. And one of the schools needed a full scale IQ test, so I got him tested. I wasn't expecting for them to come back to me and give me any new news, but they did. And so I took a moment to digest it, but I said, wow, how strategic. Like God is always preparing us for moments even before we know it, before we get there. Because I feel like I was already prepared for intellectual disability. I was already prepared for the thought that he be with me as he grows. I'm able to see, what it's looking like now. That he's still not potty trained and he's cognitively just not able to understand that. And just so many different other little things and difficulties that we have at home. I am just always planning, and it helps to give me the fuel now. When he's 7, I'm preparing him he's going to be a big boy. My husband is 6'7". And so I always think about him being 6'7" and autistic and an intellectual disability. So what programs can we get him in now that will help prepare him for them? Because it's not cute and it's not going to be funny if he has a meltdown as a grown man that big. And there are programs and there's colleges that have programs for children or young adults with autism and intellectual disabilities. There are programs that help them to still live on their own and have care and people with them. So I take in all the knowledge for him now, and then I take notes and I put it in my important folder. So I think for parents, sometimes it can be scary to do that. So we don't, because it's so scary. But even if you have nobody, because I have my sister, she knows what to do. She's second on our life insurance. But if I had nobody, I would still look up facilities near me and homes and programs, and I would write down where I would desire for my child to go if I was not here anymore.
Most definitely. As you were sharing that in this most recent experience on Friday with the diagnosis from a disability, intellectual disability, I just envisioned that sunrise still rising, because there's still so many unknowns. And that's the hardest part, I think, at least one of the hardest parts of this journey, is you just don't know what the future holds. And there's oftentimes things that are shared and different diagnoses that we receive that it takes us back, and that wait and that process, and sometimes that mourning process all starts over again. And so it's just a very real and raw part of the journey, for sure.
And so the book that I'm writing is 100 Days of Encouragement for Families Raising Children with Special Needs.
I wouldn't
be fitting.
expect anything different from you, Camille, because that is your superpower. 100
We need
days
all
of
the days.
encouragement. It is good. How's the process coming along with your book?
It's coming along. It's quite lengthy, but it's exciting. I never would have thought I would be signed to a big publisher. That's crazy to me. But and when I see people and I meet people, like yourself, you're like, oh, but to me, I'm just like you and everyone else. We're normal people, just regular. But something has happened. The door is open, but I'm excited. It's a beautiful process.
Yeah, it's well deserved. And something tells me that you're just getting started.
Thank you. I
Definitely.
feel that.
Yeah, I do too. I would say just that superpower that you have is your vulnerability. I would say that your sincerity. I would say that you are very positive, a naturally positive person. And I also just 100% embrace and see and look to you as really an example in your faith, and just your faith for greater good and for a brighter day around the corner. And so, this has been an
Thank
incredible
you. That
show,
was
incredible
great.
podcast. We'll wrap up there. There's so much more that we could talk about. And I think it would just make a lot of sense as your book comes out to jump back on and visit more about that book. But I appreciate you being a guest on the show, and thank you for your light, your joy, your example. And hopefully someday we'll be able to have our paths cross in person and be able
Yes.
to meet in
Hope
person.
so.
This is pretty awesome what you're doing.
Thank you so much. I hope to meet you in person one day as well. I'm sure we will.
It'll happen. Yep, it'll happen. Thanks for being a guest on the show, Camille.
Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Conquering Your Clownfish. If you liked what we discussed on the podcast today and want to continue the conversation, please visit us at conqueringyourclownfish.com. And please don't forget to subscribe.